Vampire Savior is one of the greatest fighting games of all time. Its presentation is outstanding, its cast is iconic, its gameplay is technical, and its pace is unrelenting. To me, this game is Capcom at their absolute peak. But you're probably asking yourself, if Vampire Savior is so good, why isn't there a Vampire Savior 2? Well, there actually is a Vampire Savior 2, but we don't really like to talk about that guy. Okay, but seriously, how does one of the most renowned fighting games ever have a sequel that no one plays and no one talks about? Because generally, when an update to a fighting game comes out, the bulk of that game's community moves on to the newest version. But in Vampire Savior 2's case, the community actively tells players not to play the sequel. So, let's figure out this mess by taking a look at one of Capcom's weirdest and most unnecessary fighting game fumbles. Before we start, let me state for clarity's sake that in Japan, the Darkstalkers series is simply called Vampire, and the games I'll be focusing on today were never released outside of Japan, so I'll be using the Japanese naming conventions for the most part. But I'm about to say the word vampire like 9,000 times, so I'll try and make it easy for all my gaijin gamers out there. In 1994, Capcom released the first game of the series titled Vampire: The Night Warriors. While a bit dated now, this was a beautiful and mind-blowing release for Capcom, as it was their second fighter after all of the various Street Fighter 2 updates, and it blew everything else out on the market visually. This was a true showcase for Capcom's new CPS2 arcade hardware. Next in 1995, the sequel, Vampire Hunter: Darkstalkers Revenge, was released. This was basically a more refined and realized version of the first game, so now we have a pretty, fun, and deep fighter. Although it's been overshadowed by the next game in the series, it's still worth playing today. And then in 1997, Capcom revamped the gameplay of the series altogether and put out an entirely new but incredibly unique third game in the series titled Vampire Savior: The Lord of Vampire. This is the game that's still being played today in big tournaments. It was a revolutionary game, and so many ideas that this game originated can be found throughout the genre, even now. It's a classic. Okay, so 1, 2, 3. Easy. Alright, that's where the Darkstalkers series probably should have stopped. But we weren't so lucky, because just a few months later, Capcom released Vampire Savior 2 and Vampire Hunter 2 in Japanese arcades basically simultaneously. Yeah, I said Vampire Hunter 2. This is where things get kinda dumb and complicated. Cause look, Capcom releasing an update to a game just a few months after it was released would have been goofy, but sadly on par for the fighting game genre. But releasing a sequel to the previous entry in the series of the current game at the same time? So now we have Darkstalkers 2, and Darkstalkers 3, 2. And to make everything even more confusing, Vampire Hunter 2 isn't even technically a sequel to Vampire Hunter, because it doesn't even play like Vampire Hunter. It plays like Vampire Savior. So Vampire Hunter 2 is really just Vampire Savior 2.5? Okay, I know this is a mess, and you're probably thinking you stumbled upon a Kingdom Hearts timeline video or something. So let's just talk about these games and why they exist and what they do differently. So, like I said, Vampire Savior 2 and Vampire Hunter 2 are both essentially just updates of Vampire Savior. Both Savior 2 and Hunter 2 have new color palettes for the character select, stages, and health bars. Honestly, this small change in aesthetic does give these games a different kind of vibe that does set it apart from the original quite a bit. On the sound side of things, Vampire Savior 2 keeps all of the music from Vampire Savior 1, and Hunter 2 replaces the Vampire Savior sound effects and music with sounds from the first Vampire Hunter. Which is cool, I guess. Strange, but interesting. But here's where it truly stands out. Although Vampire Savior 1 is very beloved, it does have one glaring sour spot hanging over it. You see, the game is just too damn pretty, and characters have way too many sprites of animation for the CPS2 arcade hardware's memory to handle every Darkstalkers character. so some omissions had to be made in the cast. Pyron, Phobos, and saddest of all to me, Donovan, had to be cut from the Vampire Savior roster to save space. But Vampire Savior 2's big selling point was that it was going to add these 3 back in. But sadly, no breakthroughs in CPS2 memory had been made, so 3 characters had to be cut again. So sorry if you main Sasquatch, Talbane, or Rikuo, cause they're not in Vampire Savior 2. So what was the point? Well, okay, I guess I'll just check out Vampire Hunter 2, cause it also has a different set of characters, which is just the cast from the original Vampire Hunter, which means all of the new characters like Lilith, BB Hood, and Jetta are gone. And there's also a missing slot on the character select screen just to rub salt in the wounds. What? Capcom, what? What was the point of these games? Why were these made? Who approved this? So it's practically just picking your poison on which characters you don't want in your roster. I main Fish, so I don't care about Vampire Savior 2, but Hunter 2 is missing all of the cool characters from Vampire Savior. It's just very confusing to say the least. But you might be thinking, well, at least in these games, you get to play new characters with the Vampire Savior gameplay, which is cool. But no, not even that, because Capcom didn't just port characters into the Vampire Savior engine. They changed the Vampire Savior engine, and they changed it for the worse. So here's the main reason why these strange sequels don't get played. It's because the changes Capcom made to the engine suck, and everyone hates them. No, seriously, people just don't like playing the game because it just feels like a worse version of Vampire Savior. There were many balance changes made throughout the cast, with some of them being pretty cool, like Morrigan getting her iconic shell kick, or some characters getting some deserved buffs and nerfs. But there were also many weird and baffling system changes that made it an already esoteric and complicated game even harder to get into. Stuff like taking out combo chains from jumping attacks in favor of having links in the air, which just doesn't feel as natural or as good in such a fast-paced game like this. Or the fact that dash attack frame data was hit hard across the board, so links out of dash buttons aren't possible anymore, which also just feels bad and limits characters even more. Also, throws are literally just busted in Savior 2 and Hunter 2. Somehow Capcom made the mistake that you usually only see in fighting games from amateur developers, and made throws beat jump startup, so throw loops are real and can easily win games. This situation is basically unavoidable, but hey, just don't get put into these situations with good defense utilizing push blocking to get out of harm's way, right? Well, if you've ever tried getting into Vampire Savior, you've probably heard the horrors of push blocking in this game and how it's the hardest thing ever. Unlike other games where a push block is 2 button presses away, in Vampire Savior, you have to input 3 to 6 unique buttons on different frames to push block an attack. Yeah, 3 to 6 different inputs, cause it's actually random. It's super dumb on paper, but in practice, the push block system in Vampire Savior is so deep and full of mind games that other fighting games could only dream of having. It's the perfect happy accident of something that should be terrible, but somehow turned out to be wonderful. It's tough, but it's rewarding and creates an awesome meta. Well, anyways, that sounds cool. But Vampire Savior 2 somehow made push blocks even harder. Yes, harder. Because it takes more button presses on average to get a push block out. Capcom saw people breaking their fingers in the arcades trying to get out of QB pressure and said, you know, this should be harder. Here I am playing Vampire Savior 1 and 2 at the same time, trying to tech hit the exact same move, and it's consistent on Vampire Savior 1 and impossible in Vampire Savior 2. Awesome, Capcom, thank you. Well, if I'm all out of options, I can at least activate Dark Force to get out of harm's way, right? Of course not, because Dark Force has been changed too. Dark Force used to just be a character-specific option, done by pressing 2 different buttons of the same strength that was unique to every character tied with some invincibility on startup. But now there are 2 different types of Dark Forces. The old way of doing Dark Forces now activates a universal Dark Force that everyone shares that heals you and makes you take less damage, while also giving you the ability to do air chains again. So doing the fun stuff from the last game is now locked behind meter. Okay, whatever. A universal Dark Force is a cool idea, I guess, but the cherry on top is that you don't get any invisibility on activation anymore. And the old character-specific dark forces are now done with unique motions that can't be really done on the fly. Or they were taken out altogether. So, if you're on defense in this fast and explosive game, just die, I guess. Okay, so I hope you realize that for many different reasons, these games are just weird. I can only assume that Capcom had a bunch of extra CPS2s laying around and a bunch of bored devs, and just told them to do whatever they want, cause how else could you explain this? Even if Vampire Savior's 2 intention was to be the replacement of Vampire Savior, the fact that it was released only months later alongside Vampire Hunter 2 must have just confused and alienated players and arcade operators alike. I can't even imagine what the Capcom salesman had to tell arcade owners to try to get them to order these boards. Like, hey, I know you just bought our game, but here's a new one that looks practically the same, and also, here's another one that's named after the old game, but is also a new version that looks just like the game we sold you months ago. What a headache. Worst of all though, is that Vampire Savior never did get an all-in-one perfect competitive version that has all the characters together. Multiple console ports did come out that attempted to have the entire cast, but they either had their own myriad of port-specific glitches and issues, or were based on the Vampire Savior 2 engine, so it sucked right away. So my actual hypothesis for these games' existence is that the devs were already tasked to port the omitted characters into the console ports of Vampire Savior, and while doing that, they also tweaked the game a bit and liked it enough to put out the characters in arcades. Cause why not, I guess. We can kinda see some evidence of this, cause the console ports have an older sprite of Donovan, whereas the arcade version has a new sprite entirely, hinting that the arcade development may have come later. I'm sure I'm trying to justify these weird sequels more than Capcom did over 20 years ago, but at the end of the day, we're all pretty lucky that the community didn't jump onto these games, and that we still have the good old reliable vanilla Vampire Savior, which has an insanely strong and passionate community to this day, and it's only getting bigger. So if you take anything from this video, it'd be that even in the 90s, Capcom's fighting game division was goofy as hell, and to play Vampire Savior, it's a good game. Thanks.